The ancient Greeks taught us that governments come in three forms: rule by one person, rule by a few people, or rule by many people, i.e. democracy. Rule by one person led to a strong foreign and defense policy and the overcoming of collective action problems and factions at home. But it was bad because it often degenerated into tyranny. Rule by a few of the brightest and most virtuous citizens theoretically led to wisdom and governance, but it too was bad because it often degenerated into self-interested oligarchy. Rule by the many was good because it promoted liberty and common sense, but it too was potentially bad because democracy could degenerate into mob rule, perhaps due to what some have called the madness of crowds. The very best regimes in practice, according to Aristotle, Polybius, and Cicero, were thus mixed regimes of the one, the few, and the many. Mixed regimes were said to combine the energy of rule by one with the wisdom of rule by a few, with the liberty and common sense of rule by the many. The idea was that the one, the few, and the many checked and balanced one another. The U.S. Constitution, arguably and quite unintentionally, may set up a kind of mixed regime where the power of one person lies with the president, who is a very tamed prince. The power of the few lies with the oligarchic Senate and the federal courts, about which there is much complaint. And the power of the many lies in the House of Representatives and with the people when they choose the one president and the few senators who serve 6-year staggered terms in the Senate and who then themselves choose Supreme Court justices. The U.S. government has the foreign and defense power energy of a monarchy, which is perhaps why we've been the arsenal of democracy in World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and the War on Terror. Our government may benefit from some of the wisdom of an aristocracy, perhaps thanks in part to the Senate with its filibuster, which has saved us from all kinds of bad ideas over the years. And the U.S. Constitution has provided democratic freedom and common sense governance thanks to the role played by the many, we the American people. The Constitution thus sets up unintentionally what is in effect a robust and incredibly successful system of checks and balances of the one, the few, and the many, all without having any hereditary offices and allowing all the people to pick, at least indirectly, all the officers of the government. We, the people, rule, but we do so only over a 6-year cycle of 3 staggered elections held in 3 constituencies of different size over 6 years in a row. Majorities govern, but only if they first show they are sustained majorities. Installing a majority on the Supreme Court under this system can in practice be more than a 30-year project. The question for our panel this morning is whether we could improve our system of checks and balances by allowing for national referenda and initiatives. When the framers wrote the Constitution, the technology did not yet exist to allow the many a direct, if limited, voice in the government of a country as large and as populous as the U.S. is today. Today, that technology does exist. Moreover, today we understand more clearly than the framers did that representation increases rent-seeking as compared to direct democracy, because majorities often face higher collective action costs than factions or special interests. Finally, we know today that direct democracy in some circumstances can empower median voters, thus promoting the very moderation and balance in government that our constitutional mixed regime strives to attain. Does the fact that direct democracy is feasible today to an extent that it was not in 1787 change the calculus on whether we should adopt it? What lessons should we learn from the state experience with initiatives and referenda? Should Congress set up a system of national initiatives and referenda? Can Congress delegate its legislative power to the American people without violating the non-delegation doctrine? Should national initiatives and referenda be binding or merely advisory? Would it be acceptable for a national referenda to alter the law so as to effectively reverse a Supreme Court decision? Should the health care law have been subject to a referendum, or should it now be? Should increases in the national debt level or in taxes and spending be subject to voter approval? To answer these questions, we turn to one of the most distinguished panels of law professors the Federalist Society has ever assembled. The first three speakers, Bill Eskridge, Richard Epstein, and Tom Merrill, who will speak to you in that order, are so well known to the Federalist Society and have helped this organization for so long that they need no introduction beyond our recognition of the fact that they are all brilliant. Our final panelist, Professor Robert Cooter, Professor Robert Cooter from Boalt Hall, is perhaps the most illustrious law professor in the world who has not yet addressed this group, and a mission that we're incredibly happy to correct. Each speaker will talk for no more than 15 minutes, after which we will have a discussion and accept questions from the floor. Thank you.
At some point, we'll have a PowerPoint on the screen. Until that occurs, let me thank the organizers for inviting me and for giving me such a great introduction. I think Steve Calabrese shows us the wisdom of the aphorism that short introductions are best, particularly if the word brilliant is used. Now, at some point, as I promised, there will be a PowerPoint. Until there is, I guess I will just deliver my remarks, and at some point the PowerPoint may or may not catch up with my remarks. Although I'm the Yale professor, I'm just going to set up the descriptive basis for talking about this, both from the point of view of the leading empirical study and from the point of view of the Constitution itself. The leading empirical study for initiatives and referenda is John Matsusaka's brilliant book, now let's see if it actually moves. Well, I'm afraid that doesn't work. Next slide, please. Very good. Both theoretically and empirically, John Matsusaka has outlined the primary effect of direct democracy at the state and the local level by examining the effect of direct democracy in states that have it and their budgets and what they do in those states with states that do not have it, and then using regression analyses to see if there are other variables that would explain this kind of behavior. So direct democracy is very common at the state and local level, and the question is, what effect would it have at the federal level? You can use the recent health care bill, for example, as an instance where if direct democracy had been in effect at the national level, probably the bill would not have been passed in its current form, and probably the bill would be repealed in its current form if subjected to a vote. So it can have dramatic examples, dramatic effects. But what Matsusaka does is he looks at it systematically over time. Next slide, please. What he finds is three different kinds of effects. He focuses on two, and then I add a third one. The two effects that he finds are, number one, that states with direct democracy have lower spending levels. Now, he's focusing on the period 1970 to 2000. And what he finds is that the budgetary levels of those states are systematically smaller when you have direct democracy compared with states that do not. Now, this is an example probably of what Steve was mentioning as the median voter effect, that direct democracy on the whole, both ex post and ex ante, brings legislators and legislative policy somewhat closer to the preferences of the median voter. And what Matsusaka found was that in the early 20th century, he did a brief survey from 1902 to 1942, direct democracy had an effect of somewhat higher spending levels, which he explains as reflecting the preferences of the median voter in that period for more government programs and more spending. In contrast, 1970 to 2000, and almost certainly today, the median voter prefers less government and less spending than the levels that would be preferred by legislators. That's one effect. Next slide, please. The second effect is decentralization. And this is very interesting. What Matsusaka also found, which I think is maybe a little bit more surprising, but also quite robust, is that states that had direct democracy, the initiative and referendum, had on the whole more decentralization of government programs than states that did not have direct democracy. The data tentatively support the hypothesis, therefore, that popular attitudes, at least in the last generation and probably still, support decentralization of governmental authority, and that direct democracy makes government more responsive to these attitudes. Next slide, please. A third effect is not one that is emphasized as much in the Matsusaka study, but one that I have found as well. And that is that other studies have argued or demonstrated that direct democracy is often a mechanism for reaffirming or changing public policy to reflect popular views, let's say the median voter views, on these issues of morality, expressive government. The best example that you're probably familiar with are the initiatives and referenda on the issue of same-sex marriage. And legislators in many states, I don't know about all, are more likely to adopt same-sex marriage as they did in Maine than are the median voters. In Maine, the voters revoked that. And there is an empirical study, there are a number of them, but the best one is by Heider Markel in 2007. My own work has focused on aid in dying legislation. Securing aid in dying, death with dignity, or assisted suicide, depending on how you like to phrase it, has been very difficult at the state legislative level. But it has been adopted in some states, I know Oregon and Washington, and other states probably in the future, through some kind of direct democracy mechanism. So other moral issues, such as aid in dying or medical marijuana, have been adopted by direct democracy, again, probably reflecting the views of the median voter. Next slide, please. So these are the possible advantages of direct democracy at the federal level, if you have a preference for lower spending, a preference for decentralization, or a preference for median voter attitudes on issues of morality. Question then becomes, can we have direct democracy at the federal level? And let me give three answers if I could. The first is that the lawmaking initiative, as traditionally practiced at the state level, cannot be implemented in that way at the federal level. The initiative at the state level is usually in state constitutions. Obviously, it's not in the U.S. Constitution, and indeed, Article 1, Section 7, which sets forth the bicameralism and presentment requirements for lawmaking at the federal level, does stand, I think, as a fatal obstacle to adopting direct democracy, at least by statute. Now, obviously, equally, it could be adopted by a constitutional amendment, but then you would have to go through the Article 5 process, not through an initiative or referendum, I'm sorry, Akhil Amar, to adopt this. The leading cases are Chadha, the famous legislative veto case, which is probably the leading interpretation today of Article 1, Section 7. And Chadha says there cannot be the creation of new law outside the bicameralism and presentment process, which this obviously would be. Chadha was reiterated and expanded, perhaps controversially, in Clinton versus New York City, applied to the line item veto. Next slide, please. A second possibility that I think is constitutional would be the referendum. Next slide, please. The referendum, say at the advisory level, could be adopted by Congress, in my opinion. I do have one slide that I think is actually very important. The framers' values underlying Article 1, Section 7, it seems to me, also support the Chadha analysis. And let me cite to the Federalist Papers, which I think are always appropriate at the Federalist Society Convention, particularly the ones written by Madison, which are the ones that I have up there, that the Article 1, Section 7 was not any kind of inadvertent choice on the part of the framers. It reflected a very deliberative choice to protect minority rights versus majority programs, what Steve was referring to. Federalist 10 is probably the best example of that. It also was a decision they made to favor stability over more rapid change. And it also reflected their views that a pluralist approach, rather than one where a majority could override the views of an intense minority, was one that was in the long-term interests of our pluralist democracy. So those are the values that I see in Article 1, Section 7. Now, next slide, please. I think the advisory referendum would not violate CHATA. Article 1, Section 5 gives Congress very broad authority to structure its internal deliberations. It would seem to me, either under Article 1, Section 5 or under the Necessary and Proper Clause as applied to Congress's legislative powers, Congress does have the authority to authorize non-binding advisory referenda as part of its deliberative process. Such referenda might slow down or even stop proposals that are opposed by voters. Next slide, please. Now, here's my most innovative idea, and that is that advisory referenda have the difficulty, of course, of being non-binding. Legislators can simply ignore them. But what about this idea? Take from the Voting Rights Act the idea that statutes can, and maybe more often ought to, have sunsets. In other words, you adopt a statute like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which expired after 5 years and had to be reauthorized, which it admittedly has been periodically by the legislators. But instead of having Congress reauthorize it, could you have a statute like the Voting Rights Act that says this statute will sunset after 5 years unless the voters in a national referendum endorse the continuation of the law either indefinitely or maybe for another 5 years or 10 years or whatever Congress would choose. Now, it seems to me that this idea is not optimal from the point of view of the biggest supporters of direct democracy, and indeed Madison in Federalist Number 50 makes this point, that if you wait 5 years, then the law can become entrenched, and the voters might cool off their opposition to such law. So it is admittedly not as efficacious a mechanism of direct democracy if you're really interested in median voter responses. But it might be better than the current system. And in my opinion, next slide please, this approach is probably constitutional, which is a big advantage in our system. It has the advantage of respecting the formal structure of Article 1, Section 7, and it also has the advantage of satisfying the Federalist reasons for that structure, that it allows for deliberation. It does not allow temporary majorities, which remember is Madison's language in 10, temporary majorities. It gives a cooling off period. It gives minorities an opportunity to organize and persuade their colleagues. It gives the minorities an opportunity to show that the statute can work. And it promotes some degree of stability. But remember, the Federalist Papers' position is not no change at all. It's simply a period of stability so that people can debate and see how it works. So one might argue, at least in some cases, that this actually improves upon the structure that the framers came up with in Article 1, Section 7. It might actually be not only an adequate reconciliation of pluralism, democracy, stability and change, minority rights and majority rights, but in some cases you could see it actually being an improvement. And remember, this would not be mandatory. It would be at the discretion of Congress to choose when this would occur. Next slide, please. Let me close with an idea that I'm not sure even I agree with, but you could extend what I have just suggested to the administrative arena, where again, Congress passes a statute, as it often does, delegating a lot of rule implementing authority to an agency, and then stipulating in the statute that after 5 years, the agency's basket of rules, or maybe the basket of rules limited to a certain area as Congress would choose, will be negated and overridden unless they are affirmatively approved by some kind of national referendum, which I would delegate to Steve Calabresi to actually, since he seems to know a lot about technology, almost uniquely in this room, to figure out a way to have a workable, quick, and non-fraudulent referendum. Next slide, please. And then here are the references to some of the books and articles that are mentioned in my slide. I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to hearing from Richard.
I have no slides, and I'm not sure I have any ideas, but let me see if I can try and put the two of these things together. I actually was under somewhat of a misapprehension of what I was supposed to speak about until about 10 minutes ago. That's my own neglect, but I did look at the title, and it said about government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so I decided, as I think about this problem, to ask the question of whether or not we regard the Gettysburg Address as an appropriate template for the American Constitution. And I think I come up with the answer no. And in fact, having heard Bill, I think if anything, my opposition to the idea of either referendum or initiatives is probably hardened. And let me see if I can go back to first theory. And in order to do so, I have to criticize our moderator, Mr. Stephen Calabresi, because in the way in which he put the program, he talked about the division of legislative authority and did not ask the question, which I think is absolutely key to this question, which is just how uninhibited legislative authority ought to be in a constitutional democracy where there are sort of vested individual rights. And in a constitutional democracy, we're far from being attracted by the median voter. We have, at least in the original design, a system in which there's no direction whatsoever. Everything from the president to the Senate to the House are subject to different kinds of rules, all of which are designed to create different kinds of obstacles to the creation of various laws. Now, why do we do this? Because essentially what happens is we have a deep ambiguity in our own minds about what it means when we start to evoke the image of, quote, the people in dealing with American constitutional law, or indeed with any system of governance. What do I mean by this rather simple proposition? Well, if you start thinking about the ways in which people start talking about people, they talk about it in very different ways. Sometimes what happens is we treat it as a celebration. The American people have spoken and have decided X, Y, and Z ought to be president, and what they really mean is that 54% of the voters happen to agree with one side and only 46% with the other. And what we do is we create a kind of an illusion of collective unanimity by taking a term like people and turning a majority into a total number. And in fact, our Constitution does that in one place where I think it's most misleading and most dangerous. I think the single most dangerous words in the American Constitution, in one sense, are the words "we the people," which begin the preamble. Now, you would ask, now, why is it that I would take such a negative view with respect to our document, particularly on this occasion? Well, you have to see why. You have to go back and see what the original draft of this particular provision was. And it said, we, the undersigned delegates of the following states, and then you go through the rest of the thing. What it does, in effect, in one way, is to kind of create this image of sort of coercive unanimity, and that's the kind of language that you see also when you're talking about the People's Republic of China or the People's Republic of East Germany, or closer to home, the People's Republic of Cambridge, the People's Republic of Berkeley, right? In which what you're looking at is the notion that if you can get a majority, what you can do is design and to organize the preferences of everybody. So the aggressive application of the people in terms of its ability to create and make law is, in my mind, a real open invitation to totalitarianism. Well, then you look at the other uses of the word people in the Constitution, and by detailed and sophisticated empirical techniques, I was able to identify 4 such uses in the Constitution, all of which are contained in the Bill of Rights, one of them having to do with the right of assembly, one of them having to do with the various issues on searches and seizures, and one having to do with the 9th and 10th Amendments on reverse power. Well, this is what I call the benign use of the term people in the way in which you think of the situation, because what you are doing is you're saying every individual within the society is going to be protected against the impositions of government so that the people can be secure in their homes. We do not mean by that sentence that all of us live in one giant teepee in which we have various separate rooms and they're going to be protected. What we mean is that each of us have private and individual rights and that each and every one of them should be protected against government. So the defensive use of the term people in the Bill of Rights has a completely different resonance and a completely different tone than the rather offensive use, i.e. attacking use of the term when it starts to go into the preamble. And this, of course, had real consequences with the design of the original Constitution, because every time you start hearing the term people in the preamble being invoked, it's to sort of indicate the direct relationship of individuals to the central government, which necessarily is meant to sort of underplay and degrade the role of the states in the original kind of system. So it's not as though this is simply a rhetorical flourish without institutional consequences. It surely has those kinds of institutional consequences. So now it's back to our good friend Calabresi. When you come to the situation of trying to figure out how you deal with the people, the great achievement of the the Gettysburg Address, which Steve did not write last I heard, was to the effect that you are making an argument of inclusion, that whatever the crazy processes we have in the United States to make and to apply laws, you cannot exclude some large numbers of individuals in this country from participating as equal citizens in these crazy consequences. That's essentially what the Gettysburg Address was about with the great issue of at the time, Negro slavery. And of course, it was a great intellectual achievement to do that. But it doesn't answer the question, once you have the right rules on inclusion, the way in which the particular organization is going to go. So when I think about the referendum and so forth, I think about it in two kinds of ways. I think about it, one, as a way of trying to deal with getting more things through the flow, which is the last thing in some sense that I want to do with respect to the federal government. But I also think about it as an alternative of trying to figure out how we will structure national government, which is essentially the judicial protection of individual rights in an effort to slow down the overall train of government and to make sure that the median voter cannot impose his or her will on those dissidents inside the society who happen to think other ways about the way in which they run their own kinds of lives. And so to the extent that you think that this is a constitutional democracy where finding what the median preference is the first part of the game, but the second part of the game is trying to make sure that there are many cases where they cannot move, you're going to run into serious problems. Let me just mention, as I think about it, some of the difficulties that I see in trying to work the referendum system. First of all, I'm a very prosaic guy. One of the questions I'm going to ask about this national referendum system in any of the forms that you put forward, exactly what day do you run this referendum? Now, this may seem like a small problem to you, but think back to Prop 8 in California, where you start running the referendum at the same time you're running your elections for various kinds of elective offices, and see the way in which the interactions between these things will start to take place. And as far as I'm concerned, they're much more likely to be difficult rather than to be helpful. Well, so then you try to do it the other way, and you say, well, we're not going to do it at the time of the national election. When are you going to schedule it? At this particular point, the next problem comes in. People are going to be trying to play the timing game. That is, you only get a snapshot with a referendum, and something like Obamacare would have done quite well, I suspect, as a referendum item if you had put it up sometime in April or May of 2009. You wait another 6 months, the darn thing is going to completely crater, and you come out with two very different results. This becomes a variable for strategic calculation with respect to both sides. And then, of course, it turns out that you've got two other problems with this kind of device, and one of those problems is simply just how many of these sorts of referendum do you start to put together at any given time in terms of bundles? So can you have 1, 2, 3, 10, 20 of these things going forward? And then after you decide about that, you're going to have all the problems associated with the validity of these referendums. Just try and figure out what you're going to do in a world in which you have a referendum in which you're now going to need some kind of a recount to decide whether or not at the national level this thing has worked well or has not worked well. Or to decide, once you have this thing passed on an advisory basis, what you as Congress is supposed to do in interpreting the tea leaves if the vote comes out 53 one way, 47 the other way, and you're supposed to take advice. Do you say, this is a major structural change, and so a 53% majority is not sufficient unto the day to get us to move? Or do you say, this is a straight majority will case, and if it's 51% the people have spoken, and that's all that we care about? As far as I can see, when you start looking at this stuff, what the referendum does is it dumps back into the lap of Congress another set of endless kinds of disputes that it's going to have to resolve with respect to its validity, interpretation, enforcement, and so forth. And then on top of all of this, if you're trying to figure out in a sensible fashion how it is that you limit the scope of things at the federal level so that the doctrine of enumerated powers is going to have some kind of purchase on the American conscience, you really can't do that if you're going to have yourself a system of referendum, because somebody's going to say, well, you put on the referendum that which falls outside the scope of Congress to enact after the whole thing is done. And at this particular point, you now have a series of judicial challenges that you're going to have to face on the question as to whether or not you can or cannot put that into place. So which way do we want to be moving? My view is, as a presumption, is that when you tell me that the median voter is now going to get his way as a national election, I don't even know whether to think of that as a good or a bad thing until they know something about the legislation in question. But I do know, if asked to decide whether or not we want more or less of this stuff coming out of Congress or at the national level, I'm perfectly unambiguous. I have my own constitutional amendment, which is the only time that you don't have a Senate filibuster is when somebody wants to repeal a piece of legislation that's already in effect. and that you probably ought to move up from 60 to 90% if these guys want to introduce something new. We are simply in a state where the engine is overheated in the way in which it is running, and that our particular joy is, how much do I have left? 1 minute? 3 minutes. That I don't even know if I could fill them. Well, I'll figure out a way. I think, in effect, therefore, when you do this, you find yourself into these kinds of impossible positions in which the administrative difficulties that come with the implementation of a major new scheme on top of a system which is already loaded is, in fact, a terrible mistake. So then the question is, if we're not going to do this, what are we going to try to do by way of meaning structural reform? And I think, as Bill Eskridge points out, if you wanted to get this referendum in anything other than this kind of very dangerous sort of advisory capacity, it's going to take fundamental constitutional changes. Well, I'm in favor of some fundamental constitutional changes, preferably by judicial interpretation and not by constitutional amendment, because my view about the amendment process is that given the general moods of the time, it too will turn into a runaway train which will lead heaven knows where. And what I would rather favor is going back to something of the original tradition on this stuff, in which we start taking enumerated powers much more seriously than we do. Randy Marnett yesterday put forward a rather ingenious, I'm not so sure 100% correct, kind of way of seeing how you could tuck out some portions of Obamacare. My own view is that a lot of the things dealing with these issues should be handled through the encroachment doctrine or through a really serious investigation as to whether or not the standards of rate of return regulation are met with some of the systems that are imposed. And I would think that the best way in which to get a more sane government is to make sure that when you do get short-term popular majorities, they're not allowed to trench without any kind of limitations whatsoever on the vested rights of property and liberty that exist in other citizens. So rather than forcing a way in which you start getting more stuff into the system at the political level, I would rather lower the heat, lower the decibels associated with this operation, and try to concentrate on the missing piece of the puzzle, which is the sense, where is the Constitution in constitutional democracy? Democracy, when Aristotle talked about it, was a dirty word. Republicanism was, in fact, the good word. Referendum pushes you in my direction under these circumstances in the wrong places, and generally speaking, when it comes to talking about riding wild horses into the sunset, my view is I don't want to engage in that activity. I would much rather keep these horses in the stable and hope that we could reform the current structure that we have in a way that the government that we're going to deal with is a little bit more responsive to the will of the people, in quotations, by doing a little bit less than it customarily undertakes. Thank you.
I think I come out with Richard in terms of being skeptical of the idea of national referendums and initiatives, but I'm going to do so from a rather different perspective. I also have to do so in many fewer words because I talk about half as fast as Richard does. The analysis that I would set forth, I developed in an article that was published earlier this year in the Chicago Law Review. And the task that I had there was to assess the idea of direct voting by property owners on local initiatives and issues. But I think the conceptual analysis also carries forward to the issue of the national initiatives or referendums. So basically, I see three very powerful positive arguments in favor of direct voting by citizens. The first goes by the name of the many minds thesis, or the Condorcet jury theorem. And it's a simple idea that in certain contexts, if you have the right conditions, the more people you ask about a particular question, the more likely you are to get the correct answer if you aggregate all of their answers together. A simple example of this might be the Zagat restaurant guides, which rate restaurants based on the reactions or ratings of many different customers. Many people regard these as much more accurate indicators of restaurant quality than reviews by professional restaurant critics. So the argument would be that if we have more minds devoted to policy questions, if we have all the citizens' minds devoted to policy questions, maybe we'll get better answers than if we have a small representative assembly or if we have panels of judges addressing those questions. The second powerful argument in support of citizen voting is that it's very legitimate in the eyes of any country that is dedicated to rule by the people. As the Supreme Court said in rejecting a constitutional challenge to a local referenda, direct voting is, quote, a classic demonstration of devotion to democracy. Again, we can see lots of significant evidence of this around us. To revert again to the health care reform, the first thing that Republicans say in opposing health care reform is that it's opposed by the majority of the people. The first thing Democrats say in trying to rebut that is, well, if you break the parts out, the people support many of the parts of it. So both sides appreciate the force of the argument that the views of the public have great legitimacy in our society. The third interesting thing about direct voting is that it's incorruptible. And the key here is the secret ballot. Given that individuals vote in secret on initiatives and referenda, no one can monitor their decisions. And because their decisions can't be monitored, they can't be bought, either by explicit or implicit contracts, nor can they be intimidated by threats or coercion. Consequently, direct voting eliminates many of the things that people find distasteful about representative democracy: log rolling, deal making with constituents, revolving doors, and things of that nature. For those that find the ubiquitous horse trading of representative politics distasteful, then direct voting offers a way out of the mess. Notwithstanding these three powerful pluses, I think there are also some powerful negatives associated with direct voting. The first is the mirror image of my first virtue, the many minds hypothesis. Steve alluded to the ancients worrying about the madness of crowds. So we have not only the wisdom of crowds, but we have the madness of crowds. So if it turns out that the average voter is less likely than average to get the answer correct, rather than more likely than average to get, more likely than not to get the answer correct, then the larger number of people you have voting on an issue, the more likely you are to get the outcome wrong. This means that direct voting should only be used to decide issues where we have some significant confidence that people will be well informed about the nature of the issues and what's at stake. And there are a couple of problems here when we get to direct democracy. It's not voter stupidity, but it's what we might call rational ignorance. One problem is that the larger the voting pool is, the less likely it is that any particular individual will be able to affect the outcome. And so the bigger the voting pool, the less reasonable it is for people to devote lots of time informing themselves about the issues. Another problem is that people may not have a large enough stake in the issue. If the issue is one that they regard as of somewhat remote concern to themselves, then again, it's not particularly rational for them to devote significant effort to informing themselves about the issues. And so we have somewhat of a paradox here that although the jury theorem or the many minds hypothesis suggests that in principle, the more people deciding on an issue, the more likely the answer is to be correct. Also, the more people deciding on an issue, the more likely it is that they're not going to inform themselves about the issue and will free ride on information developed by others. Now, to some extent, two other problems associated with direct voting I think can be somewhat lumped together, and they are, first of all, what we might call externalities and then intensities of preferences. So suppose that a majority has a mild preference for a particular outcome, but minorities have intense opposite preferences for an outcome. Direct voting may make it more likely that the majority preferences will prevail rather than minority preference. And again, this is a function of the incorruptibility that I cited as a virtue of direct voting. Because contracts, deals, side payments, and so forth are ruled out in direct voting, minorities that have intense preferences are less able to make certain entreaties to decision makers in order to get them to modify the outcome to reflect the preferences of the minority. The net effect is that if you have an issue as to which the majority has a mild preference but minorities have intense preferences, direct voting can actually diminish public welfare by adopting measures that diminish welfare overall. And a similar analysis can be made about externalities. If a measure is one that is likely to favor people in the voting pool but is to impose costs on people outside the voting pool, direct democracy, again, exaggerates the tendency to engage in local favoritism, or what you might call NIMBYism, not in my backyard, because there is no mechanism by which people outside the voting pool can try to have their wishes and desires communicated to the decision makers. Again, direct voting is incorruptible. contracting, implicit or explicit, is ruled out, and therefore cost exporting and various types of externalities are likely to flourish under systems of direct voting. Now, to some extent, these two problems are mitigated by advertising. If you have an initiative and advertising for the initiative is permitted, then intense minorities can pay for advertising opposing the initiative, or outsiders, people in other jurisdictions, can pay for advertising to oppose the initiative. But advertising is of a mixed effect in dealing with referendums. In some instances, it may just alert the otherwise rationally ignorant voters that in fact the issue's on the ballot, and when they go into the voting booth, they will vote their preferences, mild or intense as they may be, and again, the result just simply may be to maximize utility, minimizing rather than maximizing outcomes. So putting these features together, it seems to me that there are at least 4 conditions that are needed to be present before you have success in using direct voting as a means of adopting public policy. First of all, you have to be concerned about the size of the voting pool. Ceteris paribus, smaller is better. So I think that the optimal size voting pool for direct voting would be one in which the individual voter can see that their vote is going to have some material chance of affecting the outcome. Secondly, voters need to have a personal stake in the outcome. In the Chicago article, I argued that in many circumstances it makes sense to limit direct voting to property owners, precisely because property owners are likely to have a very profound stake in a number of local measures that affect property values. And so if you have an issue that will affect property values, land use controls, historic preservation ordinances, things of that type, property owners will inform themselves and will vote with a basis of knowledge about the provision because they have a direct stake in the outcome, whereas people who are non-property owners may have a lesser stake and will be less likely to inform themselves. Thirdly, I think it's important to limit issues to those that primarily affect the members of the voting pool. This is a direct corollary of the concern about externalities and NIMBYism. And finally, it's important to limit issues to those that affect all members of the pool in roughly the same way. Otherwise, you have the problem of majoritarian bias that I talked about earlier. Under these 4 conditions, is there room for national citizen initiatives on issues like health care reform? I seriously doubt it. I tried to think of an example of a national initiative where I thought these conditions would be met. I was not able to come up with one. So I end up being skeptical about the idea of national initiatives, but under my conceptual analysis, not under the constitutional and liberty-enhancing analysis that Richard offered, which I do not necessarily disagree with either. I do think that initiatives do have promise. I'm skeptical also of initiatives in big states like California. I do think at the local and particularly at the neighborhood level, however, direct democracy does have promise and has shown that it can work. Things like business improvement districts, special assessment districts, amendments to zoning codes, and even in good old blue state Connecticut, where I lived recently, direct voting by property owners is used to approve historic preservation districts. In all these contexts, I think direct voting has shown that it does work well because voters have a stake in the outcome, because they are well informed, and because they basically adopt results that are satisfactory to the majority or the median preference in the community. So I agree with Madison that direct democracy is okay for small but not for extended republics. Thank you.
Could you make sure the slideshow is on, please? Yeah, my slideshow. I'd appreciate that. I'm going to need it. Okay, thank you very much. Now let's see if this works. It does not, so I will tell you when to change the slides. Well, when I was a teenager, I used to hang out on a warm summer evening up at DuPont Circle, and on occasion I would take a stroll down Connecticut Avenue, preferably in the company of a young woman, and I would often walk through the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel because it was both handsome and free. So I want to thank the Federalist Society for bringing me back to the Mayflower Hotel. Unlike myself, I'd have to say the lobby is still as handsome as ever. Now, in 1975, I took a job at the University of California. And when I moved there, I didn't know anything about avocados, cappuccinos, or ballot initiatives. And having lived there, I've gotten to know them all rather well, and I rather like all of them. And I want to explain to you what I think some facts are about the way the ballot initiative system works in California. I'm not going to talk at all about the constitutionality or the legality of these matters at the federal level, and in this panel that would be quite inappropriate for me. But I'm going to talk about how the initiative system works and give you in a concrete way some information that's similar to what you've heard from the other analyses. So go to the next slide, please. Okay, here we have the ballot initiatives that were voted on in the last election earlier in this month. And I've arranged them for you. As you can see, the outcome is listed here, whether the voters whether the majority voted yes or no. This is the ballot number, and this is the descriptive title of the proposition. And I've tried to sort them by type, so let me explain my sorting. So the first one was a ballot initiative that changed a supermajority rule to a simple majority rule to pass the state budget. Many commentators felt that California was fiscally crippled in perpetual crisis because the supermajority rule prevented the state legislature from passing a budget. The state legislature could have changed this by a constitutional amendment which requires a supermajority in the state legislature. In fact, we've had only 2 constitutions in California, but over 500 constitutional amendments. This reminds me of the joke of the English tourist who comes into the San Francisco bookshop and says, "I'd like to buy a copy of the Constitution of California." And the bookseller says, "I'm sorry, we don't carry periodicals." But the point is that the California legislature is in fact responsible for most of those amendments, not the initiative process. They could have done it themselves, but as we found in recent years, they seldom do on really important areas. And so the important initiative here, very important initiative for the state of California, was enacted by the citizens through the initiative process. We also reaffirmed the nonpartisan redistricting of congressional districts. We had formally enacted such a ballot proposition, but it had not been implemented, and there was a proposal to prevent its implementation, which failed. So the nonpartisan drawing of congressional districts will take place in California. We also there was also a proposal to eliminate the State Redistricting Commission, which was defeated. That was all a part of this same issue. We also prohibited the state from taking some local funds. This was really a decentralization issue about the state versus the localities that I won't go into. But the point I'd say about this is these first 3 are all what I'd call good government measures. That is to say, they're presented to the public as good government measures. It's not clear whether the Republicans or the Democrats should favor or disfavor these matters. And that's been the characteristic of a lot of the ballot initiative proposals since the beginning, as you might expect, given the populist progressive reform origins of this system. Now, this proposition was a proposition to suspend an air pollution control law until the unemployment rate in California fell below 5%, which would never occur, right, exactly. So this was really, a bill supported by industrialists who wanted to escape fairly strict pollution standards that had been imposed by the voters in a previous ballot initiative. Now, I call this an environmental issue because we've had a number of them. For example, perhaps the most famous is the California Coastal Commission's creation, which led to a very important Supreme Court decision, Nolan. The point is that in California, in general, environmental issues have done well with the initiative process. They've tended to pass, and I think they're typically Democratic and not Republican supported. Now, the next three all have this in common. They have to do with fees or taxes being imposed on the citizens. And I think that it's a consistent result in California that fees and taxes being imposed on the citizens fail in the ballot initiative process. And I think these are typically Republican issues. Now, this fact that Californians don't vote to tax themselves in the initiative processes is a more general result. We actually got our initiative process from the Swiss. The Swiss invented this system and have a very long tradition of ballot initiatives as well as referenda. And one of the characteristics of those results, as Bruno Frey has shown, is a persistent vote against more taxation of the citizens. And another characteristic of them is they tend to be hostile to incumbents in some way. There's a kind of feeling among the citizens of Switzerland that there's a political class, and this political class needs to be constrained. And any proposal to make life easier for them or to increase their incomes tends to do poorly with the voters, and I think that's also true in California. Finally, we had this legalization of marijuana, which I think is one of those morality issues that Bill mentioned in discussing Matsuda's work. I think there is a tendency in California for citizens to try to affirm majoritarian morality through the initiative process. This is most recently seen in the constitutional amendment, which stipulates that marriage in the state of California will be between a man and a woman. Previously, the Supreme Court of California had decided that it was a violation of the California Supreme Court to restrict the benefits of marriage to different sex couples rather than to same-sex couples, and that was overturned in a ballot initiative earlier in the year. Okay, next slide, please. Now, what are the patterns? Okay, no more taxes. That's one thing we see. Better environment, that's what we see. Conservative morality and good government consensus. That is to say, when there's a consensus over a change that's required for better government, that consensus tends to express itself in the ballot initiative process. Next slide. Yeah. Okay, now let me say some trends about the initiative process in California. First of all, they're very popular and they're very controversial. They're very popular in the sense that there is absolutely no movement to repeal or to inhibit their the ballot initiative activity, although there's a lot of controversy and there's a lot of grousing. Still, the voters tend to like this system. Also, the most important statutes in California in recent years have come through the initiative process, so that it seems that things are being done which wouldn't have been done in the legislature or wouldn't have been done in the same way. We're also getting more initiatives, and we're getting more expenditure on those initiatives. The expenditures on initiatives has surpassed the committees that are set up to enact these ballot initiatives have to register and report their income and their expenditures, as do lobbyists in Sacramento. And it used to be the lobbyists got a lot more money than the initiatives process, and now that seems to have tipped, although it's hard to say because the numbers are rather stochastic in the initiative process, depending upon whether there's a big initiative that people with money care about. Anyway, it does seem that those numbers have tipped, and we may be settling into an equilibrium where about twice as much is spent on the initiatives as opposed to lobbyists. Next slide. All right, pass over that. That's the one that gives the exact numbers that I'm not going to explain. Now, as I see it, for about 200,000 years, the human species struggled to try to understand what caused disease and never came up with a reasonably valid theory until the late 19th century, until the disease theory was discovered. And that's because disease is a very stochastic phenomenon, and identifying causation is really not easy to do. And the same thing is true with the initiative process. Many of my friends in California like or dislike the initiative process, depending upon whether they like or dislike the most recent big initiative. And this is not a systematic way of thinking about it. I've given you trends, I've given you some facts, But the question of whether they're stable and enduring depends upon what the underlying causes are. And to know what the underlying causes are, we really need a theory. And I want to suggest to you what I think the simplest theory might look like. Next slide. Back one. Sorry. Back one. Sorry, my fault. Okay. First of all, the important point that I think Professor Merrill discussed is the fact that direct democracy replaces legislative bargains with the rule of the median voter. Now, what I mean by legislative bargains are deals that are constructed where people trade votes in order to get compromises that can be enacted. And it's exactly that process which is impossible in the initiative system. Indeed, it's impossible as a practical matter. The transactions costs of large groups of people bargaining with each other are prohibitive. There's no mechanism for doing it, and it's more than that. There's law prohibiting it because we have something called the single subject rule. All the states that have the initiative process have a single subject rule. Many more states have a single subject rule for state legislation where it's not applied with much rigor. But with respect to ballot initiatives, it is applied with rigor, and judges have and do set aside ballot initiatives on grounds that they combine more than one subject. Now, I can't go into the single subject rule, but it's I have a whole theory of it. I'd like to explain it to you. It's explained in this article, as indeed is the underlying theory of how direct democracy replaces legislative bargains with the rule of the median voter. But I can't go into that now, but it is an essential part of the initiative system. Okay, next slide, please. Now, there are three general consequences, then, of median government, of government by the middle voter, as opposed to bargain government in the legislature. And they are, first of all, no unpopular statutes. Secondly, no riders. And third, no log rolls. Now, riders are unpopular bills that would never pass on their own, and log rolls are combining issues that would never pass singularly, but will pass when combined. And these characteristics, if we went back and went through the facts that I explained to you, you would see that these facts are all characteristics. Okay, now I'm going to conclude. Let's see, next slide, please. The federal implementation would might be an initiative process for citizens or a referendum option for Congress. I'm not going to go into that. What is, I think, really important is that it would only create statutes and not constitutional amendments. And that's a very, very important feature. It addresses a lot of Richard's concerns. I haven't discussed the extent to which the ballot initiative process has been used to overturn courts, but where you can't change the Constitution, you're not going to overturn the court's interpretation of it. Also, it's very important that a single simplicity requirement be imposed on the initiative process. For that reason, you can't have something like Obamacare, a 10,000-page document, submitted, more than 1,000 pages, submitted to the public. It's got to be something much simpler than that. All right, final slide. So let me conclude then with this thought that living in California, it's like cappuccino and avocados, it's really quite engaging, this referendum process. Even the cows in the field are talking about the most recent initiatives. Everybody knows about it. People talk about voter ignorance, about voter manipulation. The other day I was talking to a woman who's a very prominent lawyer friend of mine, and she was complaining in this way, and I said, well, look, who's your state representative? She said, well, actually, I don't know. I don't know the name of my state representative. I said, who's your state senator? She knew the name of the state senator. I said, how has your state senator voted on any bill this year? She didn't know. But she sure knew about those ballot initiatives. So my point is this. The ballot initiative process engages the people, and insofar as doing so, insofar as engaging people in democracy promotes government for the people, then direct democracy does as well. Thank you.
I'm going to start by asking a question, and then I'll let each of the panelists comment on each other's presentations. And I guess I should direct my question to Tom Merrill. And the question is, Bill Eskridge has pointed out that the best empirical evidence in California and other states with initiatives shows that there are lower levels of spending and more decentralization as a result of initiatives. Tom, however, makes the very powerful argument against initiatives and referenda that they fail to take account of intensity of preferences, and intensity of preferences may matter a great deal. And I guess my question for Tom is, do we care about intensity of preferences with respect to government spending and government taxing, or is intensity of preferences most relevant for lawmaking, things that may affect civil rights or that may outlaw some behavior or legalize other behavior? And would there be a case for initiatives and referenda that dealt only with what the British used to call the power of the purse that belonged to the House of Commons, only raising the national debt level or spending or taxing, whereas outside of the power of the purse area, we may think intensity of preference ought to matter more. Intensity of preference in spending certainly matters a great deal on K Street and with respect to earmarks, but that doesn't seem to be entirely a good thing. Any thoughts about drawing a line there, Tom?
Excellent question, Steve. Well, on one point I would make is that spending and taxing would have to be disaggregated. So there would be on certain individual items intense preferences about spending for this or not spending for this. And conversely, there might be intense preferences about being taxed on certain activities and not being taxed on certain activities. As far as the overall budget is concerned, and the question of what the size of the government should be, what percentage of GNP the government should take, I would tend to agree with you that I would much rather have median voter preferences here rather than leaving this up to the kind of political process that we seem to have right now. I do think that I don't agree necessarily with some of the implications of Bob Cooter's presentation about California, and I wonder what would happen to the state if everything were decided by voter initiative and they voted down every single tax and they improved every single spending measure. And then they approved all these environmental measures, which are basically just expenditures through the regulatory process, which are not covered in the official budget. And the state would be even more of a basket case than it is right now. So I'm not sure that even on your favorite issue of how big government should be or what the budget should look like, that the voter initiative process would work out to reflect the views of the median voter, unless perhaps we had balanced budget requirements and people were asked to vote on what the size of the budget should be. Maybe that would work.
Richard, and then I should let Bob.
Yeah, I mean, why anyone would want to take California, a pathological case of terminal illness, as a kind of a national role model is, I think, very scary. And let me just mention one of the initiatives which I think showed the point. You mentioned very quickly that they, through the referendum process, established the California Coastal Commission, I gather, right? This expropriative agency and so forth, which then was slapped down mildly by the Supreme Court for some of its activities in the Nolan case. This is exactly what the problem is. Tom mentioned that there was a property requirement that he thought made sense with respect to local initiatives, but this is a classic case in which the median voter thinks it's just absolutely wonderful to tell somebody else that they can't build on their lands, and the net loss in value concentrated on a small number of individuals is enormous. The entire situation starts to break down in 1,000 ways. And the basic point that I wanted to make in my speech, which I still haven't heard answer, is if you find a more efficient way to get to the median voter, you have to worry more about the expropriation issues. And so if you have a system which combines media voter preferences with pathetically weak protections of property rights on individuals, it becomes a giant expropriation machine. And a lot of the stuff, with example, the defeat of the environmental sort of relaxation of these rules on global warming shows exactly the same kinds of situations. So my own view about this is that you cannot talk about popular democracy unless you talk about some independent constitutional constraint against its excesses. And if you make the machine more efficient at the same time the rest of the stuff falls into desuetude, you're going to end up with a California situation writ large. And God knows we have enough problems now, but we should be exhorting our Supreme Court to be less comatose than it is on these issues, and to actually start to think that the imbalance that they talked about from Aristotle on forward, that popular democracy doesn't reflect the distribution of stakes when people have powerful interests or large interests and other people have none, can't do it. In America, we now have a world where you could do taxes of ruin. It's just this last point. You have 50% of the United States or more not paying any income tax at all under the current arrangements, and something like, what, I don't know, 30, 40, or 50% coming out of the top 1% of earners in the United States, the same thing as in California. That's a recipe for disaster. And so I think that we have to really think about bringing the judiciary back into this situation. Otherwise, we're just going to get more of the same.
Bob Cooter. Professor Cooter, do you want to respond at all to the?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. I'll say something to each of our speakers. First of all, I'd like to point out that if the trigger is short enough on a sunset, that is to say, if the bill sunsets unless it's confirmed at the next election, then in effect you have the Swiss system where every important federal act of federal legislation has to be confirmed by in referendum by the voters. To Richard, I'd say this. I wasn't suggesting that the initiative process could operate well in a context where there was not an entrenched constitution with property rights and liberties protected. In some political traditions, it may be able to. I doubt that it could in the United States. But it seems to me characterizing the government of California as a giant expropriation machine is weird because it's always in comparison to what? I mean, the joke, the economist comes in to work in the morning and her colleague says to her, "How's your husband?" And she says, "Compared to what?" Well, the question is, what you've got to show is that the expropriation is accelerated by the initiative and referendum process rather than by the legislature. I've never seen any evidence of that at all. In fact, people talk about the paralysis of the California government. We pass over 1,000 bills a year. And most people don't even know what they say. Actually, most of them are taking money from one person and giving them to another.
So, I mean, what you're doing is you're talking about something which is 5% of the problem, and you're ignoring something which is 95% of the problem. Start with public unions.
I thought this was a panel on direct democracy.
Yeah, but it is, and why it fails is what it is. I mean, you can't talk about these institutions in a void, and that's what's going on. And I'm trying to basically bring back that element. I don't care which way you do things. If you're going to die both ways, I want to find out a way to live.
Professor Eskridge.
Okay. Well, it is a panel on direct democracy, but maybe a friendly amendment to what Richard is saying. Maybe all of these panels can be deemed to be panels on limited government. So we have an elastic jurisdiction here. So thinking of elastic jurisdictions, I do think, Bob, there is much to recommend, actually the constitutional rule that I suggested. And that is that we're barred at the federal level from adopting a lawmaking initiative. And I think maybe that's not a bad idea. I mean, even still, I think there's some good arguments that are made by the framers. And even under modern circumstances, with Stephen Calabresi's magically, now I do hope that your mechanism for doing this works better than PowerPoint, Steve. So maybe this is an indication that this is not a costless mechanism. It might be useful, however, to focus instead, if you want some kind of popular input at the national level, on the sunset referendum or even advisory referenda. I don't think that would be a big change in government, so it's not entirely responsive to Richard. Here's the other analytical point I would make, and that is I would disaggregate. It might not be useful. Remember, the other thing about this panel is we are given full reign to be framers. We're not constrained by California, and we're not constrained even by the moderator. It might be useful.
That is true.
We're obviously not at all constrained by the moderator. It might be very useful to think in terms of your own position. Maybe certain kinds of initiatives or referenda might be potentially useful, and others might be potentially toxic. So let me make three distinctions. This doesn't exhaust the field. But for example, Steve wants us to talk about budget initiatives or budget referenda, okay? Now there are data on that. There are data. The Matsusaka book is the leading book. The Matsusaka book does establish that even after regression analyses, states with initiatives and referenda do have lower levels of spending. Now, I do not think that Matsusaka looked at lower levels of regulation. In fact, that might be difficult to quantify, just crudely. So that might be one kind of way of thinking about it. The second would be the good government stuff. I think we do not want to lose track of Bob Cooter's excellent insight. It's a John Hart Ely insight, that the haves tend to want to preserve their own power. And this is one of the original motivations for the California initiative and referendum. And one might argue that this has been one of those areas where the initiative referendum probably has produced better legislation than the legislators themselves. And even a libertarian might agree with that, right? So that's the second one.
A very low bar.
That's the second one. A very low bar indeed. That's right. Now talking about low bars, what about issues of morality? Now that's a different kind of analysis. On issues of morality, following a median voter model, I think Richard and I are going to agree today, but maybe disagree tomorrow, that this is very dangerous. And this is exactly why there, in fact, has been a lot more judicial review of morality-based initiatives traditionally. And when I say traditionally, I'm talking about the last 40 years or 45 years at the U.S. Supreme Court level and probably at the California Supreme Court level, though I've not researched that. I would defer to other people. And so to the extent that the issues that I think it would not be recommended maybe as much for morality-based issues.
Richard.
But to the extent that it does exist, for sort of Elysian, John Hart Ely type of reasons that support the good government feature of it, might be even more skeptical of the morality-inducing feature of it.
Professor Epstein, and then we should go to questions.
This is a short comment on how difficult it is to translate from the state to the national level on issues like taxation. At the state level, if you look at the tax system, the most powerful constraint in many ways is exit. So the tax structures tend to be relatively flat. Exit is a lot harder out of the United States, and the tax structures could become much more progressive. So it's not at all clear to me, if you're running something through a progressive system at the national level, that expropriate thy neighbor through a tax system doesn't have more salience when the exit rights are weaker. And this is just another version of the same point that you cannot look at these referendum stuffs in isolation from the other structural features which put the whole system together. And so I remain very, very apprehensive about this. I've been a long, flat tax guy. My view is if you put that into place, it stops all of this chicanery because you can only fight over budgets and you can't fight over fractional shares. I think it's a fair implication from the takings clause. It has in fact been adopted with respect to the First Amendment in the Minneapolis Star cases. And if you want to talk about a reform, you give me the flat tax. I'm going to be much more sympathetic at the federal level to the initiative or referendum process.
Richard, what about a simple reform where the national debt limit can only be raised by a referendum of the voters?
I think that's a real potential disaster, because suppose you don't raise it, you just shut down the entire government on a 51-49 vote. Would you depend upon the fact that there's all of a sudden burst of revenues or a sudden decline of revenues and so forth? The advantage of running this through the flat tax mechanism is in fact that it is essentially resistant to the kind of discontinuities that you get whenever you try to impose strict dollar caps on anything.
Question from the audience. Thanks.
Terry Walton.
Pull the mic down.
Can you pull the mic down?
There you go. Is it on or?
Yes.
Okay. Gerald Walpin. The initial examples of referendum came from local districts, local townships, where the number of people there is very small and the knowledge of the citizens was very direct. You are now using the analogy of state, including California, referendum, and suggesting or raising the question of having it national. My question of you is, how do you possibly conceive of national referenda, even sunset proposals, where such proposals could be, for example, when President Roosevelt and Congress instituted selective service, an unpopular proposal, to have a sunset provision, a referendum on ending selective service within a year? Or how about a referendum on sending our troops to Afghanistan or Iraq? Aren't you proposing something that's ultimate disaster for security issues, where the public doesn't have the necessary information, which is, of course, restricted? And isn't this just to repeat, a proposal for disaster for the security of the country?
Yes, Richard.
Yes, I think is a pretty good answer to that question, and that goes to the point that I made earlier in my talk, which is the scope of the potential topics for a referendum necessarily limited at the state level. When you go to the national level, you run into all of these particular programs, and if you don't like that one, just make it a little ugly. Suppose you have two inconsistent referendums which aren't apparently such and they both pass. What do you do then?
I want to take issue with that a little bit myself. It seems to me that there really is a difference between referenda dealing with questions of spending or of the debt limit and referenda dealing with lawmaking or whether we should go to war or not, or whether we should overturn a court decision. And
spending for troops or police?
well, ultimately, the questions about, I think that the spending levels could only be addressed once every 2 years when there's either a presidential or a midterm election. But I think if the public is opposed at some point to spending on troops, I think that's probably something that should be taken
Look,
into
I just
account.
like to point out that the military diplomacy, these problems have not been aggravated by the referendum system in Switzerland. I mean, they've been running. They have a perfectly competent army. They have an excellent army. What?
Yeah, and
They
they're
have the
4 million
most-
sensible people.
What?
The difference is you got 308 million fractious individuals as opposed to 8 million stolid
Oh
Swiss.
man,
This
you
is
don't
not
know
all-
about the Swiss. The
Switzerland
Swiss
is-
have 4 languages,
We
4 official
understand all
languages.
that,
They
but
have.
they're small
Switzerland is a-
and they're neutral.
Switzerland's a very divided country. It does have 4 languages. It's evenly divided between Protestants and Catholics, which has historically been a big issue in Switzerland. It's evenly divided between city dwellers and people who dwell on the countryside. It's divided into 26 cantons, which further fragments power. So there are actually a lot of divisions, and yet the country is very prosperous.
Yeah, and the country doesn't get involved in a lot of foreign wars.
In fact, they were neutral in World War II.
What's that?
They were neutral in World War II.
Scoundrels
That is
were
right. And
neutral.
from Switzerland's point of view, that was a winning strategy. Okay? So if you want to look at the self-interest of the country, now here's my response to the foreign affairs feature. And that is, I think it is quite right, and you're doing the exercise you should be doing, limiting initiatives and referenda to where it would be most appropriate. But I cannot help but introduce some realism into this. We are in Washington, D.C. And if
There's
the
no realism.
the president in World War II, the vote in Congress was virtually unanimous to enter World War II. I understand. Vote was virtually unanimous to get into World War II. The votes of Congress, if the president says we need to fight godless communism or the horrible Nazis or terrorists, and some members of Congress say, well, let's put some kind of 1-year sunset on this, the president is going to win those battles, okay? And by the way, if the president doesn't win those battles, I'm not sure that this is not a good thing. Think about the war in Vietnam. If President Kennedy and President Johnson had gone before Congress saying, we want some more appropriations, we're increasing the troop presence in Vietnam, et cetera, if Congress had said, okay, we're actually going to declare war, or whatever the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was, well, we're going to make this a 4-year sunset. And then it's going to go back to the people who, after all, are sacrificing their lives. I'm not sure that would have necessarily been a bad idea for the war in Vietnam. So even this very fractious area, and Switzerland might be a good example of the success of this strategy, might be one that there are some virtues as well as some vices.
Professor Epstein, and then we'll go to the question.
I have nothing to say, unusually.
Okay. Question.
Yeah,
He's just waving.
I want to pick up a little bit more on the voter confusion issue. So, in the example of California this last election, when the oil companies supporting the Proposition 23, which would put on hold the environmental initiative, realized that was going down because of popular opposition, they shifted their support to Proposition 26, which was a 2/3 fee increase, knowing that the way that was going to be implemented, AB 32, was that they would have regulatory fees imposed on the industrial sector, and if they changed that rule, they could accomplish almost everything they wanted. And the voters gave inconsistent responses, which shows there was a great deal of voter confusion. And it's a huge problem with that initiative process generally. And the other thing, the locking in of funding formulas, and this is, I guess, a different aspect of voter confusion, or not realizing the consequences of what they're doing by initiative. There's a lot of money in California that could be used to address funding problems, except it's tied up because of locked-in funding formulas that were adopted because they were for the children, or for schools, or police, or for fire, that have nothing to do with what the budget needs to be taken in account of. And so the voter confusion problem is real, and I don't see you talking about that enough to try to deal with it.
Professor Eskridge.
Let me just say one thing. I think it's a very intelligent question. John Matsusaka, in a separate paper, not in the book that I talked about, has actually examined the voter lock-in phenomenon in California of the budget, and he has found it to be utterly underwhelming. There is a statistical paper that does look at that by Matsusaka of the University of Southern California Business School. And a lot of liberals believe this has been a real problem. It's been undocumented by any of the liberals, and it is refuted, at least preliminarily, by that empirical paper.
Professor Epstein.
Yeah, I mean, again, on the funding issue, one of the great achievements of the California referendum was the Jarvis-Gann Amendment, if I'm not mistaken, right? And you want to talk about a built-in long-term time bomb with respect to how you organize the tax system, that turns out to be it. Because what you do is you create a situation in which taxes don't go up until there's an exchange in title, which has the necessary consequence that people will not sell because the new tax lien essentially obliterates all the gains from trade. This thing has been around for 30 years. It has completely warped California politics with respect to other issues, including school fundings and so forth. And what you really have to understand is when you start making these major constitutional changes by referendum under these circumstances, you come up with systems which have a certain kind of kooky feature precisely because there's no way in which you could bargain or could talk them down or to change them after they're put into place. So, I mean, when I actually look at these referendums, Matsusaka's not talking about this one in those studies, and neither was Bob. So, just the three that I've heard about, what John Eastman said, the one that we've heard about with respect to the Nolan type situation, and so on, I don't think you come up with a very good long-term consistent profile, and you have very strong evidence that California is a basket case because it hasn't learned how to govern itself, and it's not the referendum only, it's the fact that the property rights stuff gets such short shrift there and at the federal level.
Professor Cooter?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like to say that there are a lot of attempts to manipulate the voters through the framing of the ballot initiatives, and fortunately, that never happens in the legislature.
No.
The second, yeah,
It's the argument
the
that they're both
the
terrible.
second thing I'd like to say is that the Jarvis-Gans bill, which is this Prop 13 that limits caps the rate of tax at which your taxes can increase until you sell your property, was actually caused by economists. It was caused by economists because they got good econometric models for updating the value of property when it was not sold. And as a consequence, people found that they were living in houses where their tax rates were had gone up 200 or 300% in a couple of years. And what did the legislature do about it? They were quite happy with that situation.
No,
Professor Cooter, is a follow-up question. Is there any cost to initiatives and referenda, in your view, in California, in that because so many important decisions are made by initiatives and referenda, the voters of California may have less of an interest in who is elected to the state legislature or to be governor? And do those elections become much less consequential, and is that potentially a cost of having initiatives and referenda?
Right. Well, I actually don't think that is a cost. I think the real cost of the initiative process is what I'd call voter fatigue or initiative fatigue. I think the problem is the voters can only handle a certain number of them.
Right.
And the system we have for rationing who can get an initiative on the ballot is collecting signatures, that is to say, throwing away money. And there are much better ways of doing this. So I think the real problem is getting too many initiatives so the voters don't have the intellectual energy and resources to understand them. Not that they don't care about the legislature, because the legislature is still doing it so much.
Yes, Roger.
Roger Pilon, Cato Institute. Professor Cooter, I just wonder why it is that you're so resistant to the points that Richard is making. There is another form of direct democracy, of course, and that's people voting with their feet. You look at states like New York and California, and if I may draw from international affairs, you're looking at failed states. In New York, half the budget is paid for by 1% of the population. In California, the payers are leaving, tax takers are coming in, and the population is such that for the first time in 100 years, you're not going to get a new House seat, it looks like. So these are the ultimate consequences of the kinds of things that Richard's talking about, and you seem to be oblivious to it.
Well, I don't think the argument that New York and California are suffering the same problems of people leaving with their feet is an argument against the initiative system. My impression was that the state of New York has done perfectly well in driving investors out of the state without the help of the ballot initiative system.
That's not Roger's argument. His argument is you're trying to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic without fixing the hole in the bottom of the hull.
I'm trying to talk about direct democracy.
No. The point about it is you have to talk about the limitations on direct democracy in order to do it. What you're doing is you're making a machine that's more efficient, assuming that you're right, at sinking the ship. This is roughly like saying the way you handle the common pool problem when you're hunting for whales is get better technology to kill them. You've got to make sure that you address the fundamental underlying problem, and the fundamental underlying problem with direct democracy is it's direct and it's democratic. Other than that, it's fine.
I have a motion, Mr. Chair. I move that we rename the panel the Titanic and Why the Ship of State is Sinking.
Second the motion.
All right.
But I certainly want to agree with this gentleman's point about competitive federalism of the states. I think it's just great. In fact, of course, California has, in the last 50 years, been one of the states that has experienced the greatest increase in population. Nevertheless, I think it's also the case that California has created a bad situation for itself, that people and money are leaving currently, and I think there's a lot of pressure through the initiative system in part to correct it.
I don't believe it.
Next question.
Yeah, so in his presentation, Professor Eskridge said that states with direct democracy have lower spending, but if I understand the data from Matsuzak and others correctly, is this microphone working or?
Yes, it
it's
is.
working.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I understand the data correctly, this lower spending with states' direct democracy is driven by hostility to taxation, which at the state level results in lower spending because most states have balanced budget constraints and exit constraints. Of course, at the federal level, we don't have a balanced budget amendment, and as Richard pointed out, it's much tougher to exit. So I wonder whether that would translate to the federal level without a federal balanced budget amendment similar to the ones that exist in most of the states at referenda.
It won't work. My view is balanced amendment won't do it. As I said to Steve, the only way you could make this work on budgetary matters is to have a flat tax so you cannot constantly ratchet up the progressivity associated with the system.
Well, but of course, if you could ignore Chatham and have an initiative at the federal level, you could adopt a balanced budget constraint at the federal level by initiative.
You could do it. I mean, but
know.
you're running
I
a
mean,
campaign now in which $250,000 is decided as wealth, and you have exactly the opposite political pressures.
We named the panel, so it's not balanced budget. Maybe it's the flat tax. So Richard, what you should be Richard, you should be in favor of something where you're never going to get the flat tax through this Congress. I predict that, and I'll bet you money on that.
No, you can't bet money because I'm on your side.
Okay, unfortunately. But, wait a minute, no. we've renamed the panel. If Richard thinks that the panacea is going to be a flat tax,
No panacea is an
I
improvement.
would suggest the only chance you have of that, Richard, Supreme Court ain't going to give it to you. Congress is not going to give it to you. President Obama's not going to give it to you.
And the
The
Democratic...
only chance this man has is through a voter initiative, which would impose the flat tax.
And
And in fact, I would go one step further. Let's throw it all out the window. Let's throw out Article 5 as well, and let's make the flat tax a part of the U.S. Constitution.
Now you're talking. Look, I mean...
So I think Bob Cooter, I'm neutral on this business about whether we should have this stuff, but I think Bob Cooter has just gained a very important ally.
No, he is not. The problem, of course, is that I could put the flat tax referendum on there. Somebody could talk and put the steep progressivity tax amendment on there, and the same forces that led to the distribution in Congress could lead in the opposite
then
direction.
confine the process just to approving the budget or approving
No,
spending
look, I mean,
or approving.
No, he wants taxes, Steve.
No,
that's not his
If you-
responsibility.
This
ultimately,
is
if you
the
control-
serious problem. I mean, and let me just sort of state it. A system of checks and balances has a chance of working if there's at least one sane player inside the system. But when it comes to matters of taxation, we have everybody in its own way that has gone berserk, and so that there is no particular government check when everybody essentially is in agreement on the wrong feature. There's nothing about the original design that can stop that. What we really need is a re-education of political morality from the ground up, and if you could do that, then maybe you would get this through one way or another. Is it impossible at the Supreme Court level with that collection of people? The answer is yes. But remember, these are the same guys who 25 years ago put in the flat tax with respect to newspapers in the St. Paul Minneapolis Star case. So it's not an intellectual impossibility. Just take Sandra Day O'Connor's arguments from that case, translate it to this panel, and you've got there constitutionally. The disparate impact tax, Armstrong against the United States. I could write the brief if I could only get Bill Eskridge to co-sign it.
Yeah, and that would get you like not even one vote with both of us.
No.
We'd get put in jail.
No.
They would send the marshals after us.
I would get 2 votes.
Richard, would you be in favor of banning earmarks
me.
or
What?
would you be in favor of banning earmarks or giving the president a line item veto? Do you think that would improve things?
The difficulty with the earmark stuff is they're too small a matter in this crazy world. And in fact, the allocative efficiencies, if you get a good earmark as opposed to a bad earmark, I think it's just too small to matter. The situation that we're in today requires major renovations of the system. And if you're going to have a direct democracy system which improves, you're going to have stronger constitutional stuff. And that means that you have to get everybody to revisit the standard Scalia
just to
line of
disagree-
legislative dominance.
Just to disagree, I think the argument could be made that what you need is median voter control over spending rather than bargain
No,
control over
exactly
spending.
wrong, because the median voter is somebody who, in terms of wealth, controls 10% of it below and 90% of it's above. In fact, it's the top 1% that is most vulnerable to this situation, and median voters exacerbate the situation. The ancient requirements with respect to property qualifications for voting were a way to try to stop that. That's too inclusive, kind of crazy. So if you're not going to have property qualifications to vote, you have to have property protections in a constitution to allow the median voter to win. The median voter is a deadly instrument when it comes to wealth distribution. I'm shutting up, Tom.
Steve, I just wanted to say that I thought Bill's listing of the various constitutional ways of adopting the initiative at the federal level was missing at least a couple of ideas. One is if you combine, I'll just throw this out, if you combine the American trucking case where the Supreme Court reaffirms that there's no delegation doctrine with the Dalton versus Specter case, which upholds the Base Closing Act, you could come up with a system where you create a national referendum commission, which holds national referendums, certifies the results of the commission, then gives it to the president to approve or disapprove on an up or down basis. That eliminates the possibility of judicial review of the commission, and there's no delegation limitation because the decision is that of the commission affirming the vote of the public, and so bingo, you've got the national initiative right there.
Yes, but it's not law under CHATA, Article 1, Section 7.
No, it'd be administratively based law.
Yeah.
you know.
So that's a problem.
Question.
Alden Abbott, if we're talking about constitutional amendments, what about one which actually passed the House and Senate in 1982, say limiting the state, it could be on the state level, of course, but limiting the federal government to expending no more than X% of the GDP every year. That deals with both, debt and taxation, and that, at least on the state level, might seem to be a constraint that would allow referenda to go ahead while creating a built-in limitation on spending.
It doesn't work, again, for the reasons that John Eastman hinted at in his question. He said, we beat you one way, we get it another way. Taxation is commonly understood to be a substitute for regulation on large numbers of arrangements and vice versa. And so what doesn't pass through the tax budget now passes through the regulatory budget. If you're trying to figure out what's wrong with Obamacare, if you're only looking at the direct cost, the $1 trillion or so that he's willing to bomb on that thing, you're ignoring the other $1 trillion in rate regulation losses that are going to be imposed through the rest of the system. So all it is an invitation to switch corruption from one form to another. You have to have a system of property rights that's strong enough to deal with regulation, liability rules, and taxation all at once. Otherwise, what's going to happen is the downward forces of popular democracy will consume us all.
Now, by the way, let me add this one point. And that is also, if what you want to do is have a robust regime of property rights, I don't believe the current Supreme Court is likely to deliver that to you.
As a matter of fact, the attack on Kelo has come through the initiative process.
Exactly.
Right.
And
Exactly.
and
I
as a
think
matter
Cooter hit the nail with his head. If you want to...
on the head.
No, he hit the nail with his head. If you want to respond to Kelo, the legislature is not going to respond to Kelo because they're the ones expropriating your property. The president's not going to respond to Kelo, and I don't think Chief Justice Roberts seems inclined to respond to Kelo.
No, he voted...
The main response to Kelo seems to be coming...
In fact, there have been articles, I think Ilya Somon's responsible for one of them, that shows
and
that
not
the
only that-
initiatives responding to Kelo are much more pro-property right than the
Then
legislation.
that is absolutely
That's right.
correct, and they've
That's
all
right.
been negated effectively in this. Look, I mean, if you ask me on that particular project, I would rather try to switch over one way with Supreme Court justice. Of course, I've got to get Tom to recant his brief on that particular case, but that's a different story. On that one, because the initiative process has essentially changed the configuration on this, but I think if Ilya wants to stand up again, relatively modest in virtually all states in which it is done, the most conspicuous intervention was the one in Michigan, which was done judicially.
Okay. Question?
Sure. We've been struggling here with the question of how to make the federal government accountable. And of course, one approach is to empower voters. But the founders tried to make the federal government accountable to voters through not only direct election, but through the states. And that process was eviscerated both by the 17th Amendment and by the unanticipated threat of a runaway convention. What's the reaction of the panel to the idea that what we really need is to reinvigorate the state's power and the citizens' power through state legislators to limit Congress by getting rid of the risk of a runaway convention, by giving states the power, the clear power to limit the scope of a convention, they call, so that they can once again propose individual amendments to the Constitution without the risk of a runaway convention.
And the problem is you don't get a runaway convention, but you get one called for by the wrong guys, and so the only thing on the agenda is to try to figure out how we could create a constitutional guaranteed minimum on positive rights. I mean, and you're just taking a terrible chance.
Last question.
I want to amplify a little bit more on the point raised by Professor Cooter about the lack of compromise in a process of initiative. I was Attorney General of Colorado for 8 years, where every year we dreaded what was going to come out of the voting process because we knew we would be in court defending it or challenging it for a number of years. The process we had, and any process of a true initiative, is going to have some way of getting things onto the ballot. And that requires that something be initiated by a small group, locked in place, and then go through the process without the opportunity for compromise. In Colorado, we had a process of gaining signatures first to get something onto the ballot. And once it got to that point, you had a commission that I was a member of that would then determine what the language was that would appear on the ballot, but that did not at all influence the language of the proposal itself. And we had a group once that came in that had gotten all of their signatures, everything was locked in place, but they had, through a pure typographical error, omitted an existing sentence from the state constitution. And so we pointed that out to them and said, why did you do that? And the guy just sort of scratched his head, said, well, we didn't really mean to, but must have been divine intervention, and went right on with his proposal. There really is no opportunity for compromise once something goes through a process like that. And I think that it's less significant in a situation where you're talking about initiating a statute as opposed to a constitutional amendment. But even in that situation, the legislators are very loath to change anything that has been initiated by the citizenry. On the other hand, as a Colorado resident, I benefit greatly from the tax limitations that were adopted by initiative in our state constitution. So there are some benefits for it, but I think those are much better on the state level than the federal.
A one-sentence answer. As Tom said, and I think it's correct, compromise is good when you have two extreme polarizations, both of which are lousy, and compromise is bad when one guy at the extreme is correct, and there's no way a priori to know which mechanism will dominate because you don't know which configuration is going to control.
One interesting thought that comes to mind from your comments is that no one here has mentioned deliberation as a sort of check on runaway government, which I think was something that probably loomed quite large at the time of the founding of our country. And it's just sort of striking to me the extent to which we have completely lost any faith in that occurring at any level. So, we either want to have some kind of mechanistic check by the voters, or we want to have some kind of mechanical check by some kind of originalist constitution or something like that. But the idea that we would actually constrain ourselves through mutual deliberation seems to be the last thing on anyone's mind these days.
We need to conclude. I'd like to thank the many in the audience for your questions and the few on the panel for your presentations.
And thanks to the moderator.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, moderator.
We solved all our problems.